History 425. Now we're looking at, with this week 9, we're looking at slide 7. So now let's talk a little bit about the new leader of China, Xi Jinping. So Xi Jinping is the son of the man in the wheelchair there, Xi Zhongxun. And Xi Zhongxun was a senior party official who was in charge of the area in and around Yan'an when the communists were there in the early 1940s. And he was one of the first senior victims of Kang Sheng. You remember Kang Sheng? He was in charge of the security services during that period, and he was taken out of power by Mao because of the purges that were, Mao had to blame somebody for the purges of 1942 to 44. And Kang Sheng was indeed perhaps the real fifth member of the Gang of Four, although Mao might have been the sixth one, who knows. So Kang Sheng purged Xi Zhongxun twice during the 1942 to 44 period, and then again during the Cultural Revolution, when Kang Sheng was in league with Jiang Qing, Mao's wife, and the leftists who brought about the, or who were the handmaidens, you might say, of Mao as he brought about the chaos of the Cultural Revolution in its early stages. However, Xi Zhongxun survived. He was sent to the countryside. Xi Jinping went with him, and then as a child, and then later on had to do time in the countryside himself. But Xi Zhongxun was rehabilitated early, and Xi Jinping was allowed to go back to school in the last years of the Cultural Revolution, and he graduated from Tsinghua University, that is the MIT of China, first with an undergraduate degree in engineering and later with a Doctor of Law degree. After that, he became this confidential assistant to famous PLA General Geng Biao, who was on the Central Military Commission. So this is sort of like being a clerk of the Supreme Court, except you're working for the military. Xi Jinping never actually did time carrying a rifle or anything like that, but because he is one of these people, one of these princelings, as they call them, and because he did time with the military and had a chance to build up contacts in the military, with this and other associations that I tried to tick off on this slide, he ended up building up contacts and trust in several different groups that are prominent inside the government and party. And since there are so many factions, three of which are important, the Chinese Youth League faction, the military faction, and the princelings faction, because he had at least the tolerance or support of all three of those, plus the Tsinghua people, he was always a front runner for heading up the so-called fifth generation of leadership, of which he now represents. So Xi Jinping, on his way to the top, fulfilled several important posts. He was both the governor of a province and the CCP secretary of a province, and for a brief period after Chen Xilian was deposed as party secretary of Shanghai, in a scandal that you can read about in McGregor's The Party. It's in our readings this week. Xi Jinping became briefly the secretary of the municipal party committee there. So when he eventually came to power for the first time, ever in the history of the People's Republic, someone acquired all three of these positions of the General Secretary, the President, and the Central Military Commission Chairman, all at once, rather than having to wait for that last one, the head of the CMC, for a couple years, as had been done in the past. So he is not really a compromise candidate. There's a lot of debate about this, but in my view anyway, he's not really a compromise candidate as much as he is the best candidate available who can keep these different factions from openly disagreeing with each other and causing the impression of instability as China moves forward to take a bigger place in Asia and in the world. And indeed, this is one of the reasons why he's come across with this, he calls it the Chinese dream of, this is the way I would put it, individual fulfillment in the context of an increasingly influential China. Xi Jinping is a figure who may be transformational in nature, but time will tell. It's difficult to say whether he will end up remaining an equal among equals, as he mostly is now with the other members of the senior leadership, or whether he will accrue political influence by policy successes and by avoiding the many problems that the country faces as he moves to make China's military and diplomatic presence more strongly felt around China's periphery. Let's go on to slide 8. Now I'm going to take some time to speak about some of the women in China's government and party. And the reason I'm doing this is that, as I say a couple slides hence, they are an endangered species, but they do illustrate some of the functions of the government and the party as they stand. And this is because they are unusual, they're very unusual people, and I think that they're somewhat representative of the leadership as a whole. This first one here, she's getting ready to retire, Liu Yandong. She's the oldest member of the expanded Politburo. She's part of the Tsinghua faction and Chinese Youth League factions, and she's been the head of the CCP United Front Work Department, which does work with cooperating parties and people overseas, a very important position. But now she is one of the most senior, she's the second senior vice premier. And as you remember from the previous chart, the premier, who is now Li Keqiang, used to be Zhou Enlai during the time of Mao. The premier is in charge of government, but there are vice premiers underneath the premier who have functional specialties. For example, there was a vice premier several years ago named Zhou Jiahua, who had underneath him all of the ministries, all of the industrial ministries, every single one of them. And that was a very important job to have. He was, in essence, supervising all of China's industry in the government. And of course, Zhou Jiahua was a member of the Politburo Standing Committee at the time. Now, this woman, Liu Yandong, is not on the Politburo Standing Committee. She's on the Politburo. There are no women on the Politburo Standing Committee, but she has charge of a functional area of government, that is, all of the education policy and operations. And I suspect she has other responsibilities too, but I have not been able to figure out what those are by going through the internet, even using the Chinese language to try to search that out. I'm sure it's out there somewhere, but I couldn't get a hold of it. It's interesting that she was the one who was the one of the principal interlocutors with Julia Gillard when she was there last month, the Australian Prime Minister. The Australians are a very important partner of China's. They're also a target of China. If you notice in the last couple days, there's been yet another new hacking story coming out of China, and this has to do with the plans for the Australian Secret Intelligence Service headquarters that's being built right now being stolen by the Chinese. The floor plans and probably some other information too. There have been a lot of problems like this where Australian government entities are targeted by the Chinese. And indeed, the Australians, when they make their defense plans, keep China first and foremost in their strategy. But on the economic front, the Australians recognize China as extremely important to their economic future because the Australians have avoided any sort of depression or recession in the last 5 years, partly because they export so much coal and iron ore, and this has kept the value of the Australian dollar rather high. And 1/3 of these exports go to China. So you can see the importance of that relationship. And what Julia Gillard is trying to do is establish a more long-term basis for a relationship with China, because resource exports don't last forever. It's all very interesting. It's also interesting that it's the Australians who were the first ones to sponsor a new U.S. Armed Forces presence as part of this so-called pivot to Asia. It began in late 2011 and into 2012. There's a battalion of Marines. Now, that's not very many people, but it's a very symbolic presence. And so Australia walks this line between trying to forge a new relationship with China and remaining one of the most close allies, the closest allies of the United States in the region. Let's go on to slide 9. So a rising star, and the other female member of the Politburo, is Sun Chunlan. She's 5 years younger than Liu Yandong, and like many of the leaders of the fourth generation, as they're called, that is Hu Jintao's generation. These aren't real generations once every 20 years, by the way. It's just more like once every 10 years. It's each set of people underneath each party general secretary, less than a chronological generation, but it's a Chinese political generation. So the Xi Jinping is the 5th generation, so-called. Sun Chunlan is a little bit older than Xi Jinping, not much. Maybe she's 4th generation, maybe she's 5th, who cares? It's not important. But like many of the people in the 4th generation, she was educated as an engineer and did an engineering job for a long time until she got into CCP politics, which was at mid-career for her in 1991, where she became a Labor Federation official in Liaoning province, where Dalian is, and then she became the CCP head of Dalian, one of China's most livable cities, I have to say, in the northeast. Beautiful place on the coast. It's a tourist destination, a tourist resort by the ocean. Anyway, then she went on to Fujian province, which is an important place because it's the place where semi-capitalism got started during the time of the special economic zones when they were first started up. Wenzhou is in Fujian province. It's known as China's most capitalist city. Not so much anymore, I guess, but 10, 15 years ago, that was its nickname, Wenzhou. China's most capitalist city. Anyway, then she went on to become the head of Tianjin. Now, this is a big city to the east of Beijing that is on the coast. It's one of China's special cities. The other ones are Shanghai, Beijing, there's Tianjin, and Chongqing in the southwest is another one of the special cities. I can't think of any others, although there might be. Oh, Guangzhou. Guangzhou is another one, which is in Guangdong near Hong Kong. So I guess that makes 5, maybe 6 of these special cities that don't actually come underneath the province in which they lie. They are straight underneath Beijing as far as administration goes because they're so big. So she's only the second woman in the CCP's history to head a province, and she's the only one, and these cities are ranked at the same level as provinces, and she's the only one who currently heads one. So that's a name to keep an eye on. As we go on to slide 10, I want to speak briefly about the most prominent woman in CCP politics in recent history, who is named Wu Yi. She is just retired. Wu Yi was the Minister of Foreign Economics and Trade, and she later became a vice premier and was in charge of all of the trade activity in China. Supervised several government departments in that capacity, and became a chief international negotiator in her own right. Had a very interesting face-off with some people from Taiwan at one point, where she and her assistants basically told them, nobody cares about you, you just have to do what you're told. Which there was a video of this that made it onto Taiwan television, and they were sort of reading the riot act to the people of Taiwan. I think this was about 7 years ago. But she has been a big exception in the modern history of the PRC. Previous to her, the most prominent women in politics have been the wives of senior leaders, those being Jiang Qing, Mao's wife, and the wife of Zhou Enlai. And so women in politics, their position in the senior leadership, that is in the major legislative and party bodies, has stayed at about 20% over the past 20-odd years. Instead of rising like these percentages have been doing in other countries, China's percentage of women in these senior positions, sort of middle senior positions, has remained stagnant at 20 or 21%. And they've actually fallen at the very top. So things are not progressing for women in China unless, going on to slide 11, you look at these positions. These positions are more and more prominent in society as more and more money is apparent in Chinese society. This position of being a flower vase or a huaping. Now, for those of you who have any close Chinese friends, do not dare to call anybody a huaping, because you will start a fight. Like, you've been warned. But this is the nickname that people give in China to women who hold these unfortunate positions. Now, there is a functional reason for these positions. That is that the population of China is very high. When there are these different meetings, whether they are just in restaurants or they're in big conference halls, you have streaming into these places hundreds and hundreds of people. And because, typically speaking, they won't know where they're going, you have to have people standing around to direct others to where they're supposed to go. And no matter where you go in China, if you travel to China, you will see women doing this work. You will typically not see men doing this kind of work. However, this is not a Chinese thing. It's sort of an Asian thing. I have to say, in China, it's much more common than it is in other Asian countries. I can tell you that for sure. But the idea that attractive women should be standing around to help people get where they need to go in public arenas is not a Chinese thing. It's a Chinese specialty, for certain, but it's true all over Asia. In the bottom right corner of this slide, you see an example from Japan. So now we'll go into part 2, how the CCP actually runs China, some of the methods that they use. We'll continue in the next recording on slide 13.